Okay, let's dive right into this. We spend a ton of time stressing out about all kinds of threats, right? Modern viruses, predators, whatever happens to be dominating the evening news cycle today. But right now, we're going to look at something that has literally haunted humanity for centuries. We're talking about an ancient pathogen that operates with this terrifying, almost mechanical efficiency. We are setting the stage for an explainer on a medical reality that is just as absolutely fascinating as it is deeply, deeply sobering. Yep, we are talking about rabies. I really want you to let the sheer weight of that phrase sink in for a second. The most lethal infectious disease. We are not talking about the bubonic plague here. We aren't talking about a highly contagious flu. No, we are talking about a disease where the absolute second clinical symptoms begin to show in a human being, the fatality rate is basically 100%. It's a biological absolute, and you honestly just don't see that very often in the natural world. It doesn't negotiate with your immune system, and it doesn't just make you sick. It is overwhelmingly, undeniably lethal.
Now, what's really wild about this number 14 is the horrifying story behind it. To really grasp the gravity of this disease, we've got to travel back in time to the year 1885. Picture a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister. He had a truly traumatic encounter, viciously attacked and bitten exactly 14 times by a dog. But this wasn't just a regular stray, right? It was a rabid dog. And in 1885, sustaining 14 bites from a rabid animal, that wasn't just a trip to the ER. It was considered an absolute, totally unavoidable death sentence. There was no cure, zero. The clock had started ticking, and the end was thought to be entirely inevitable.
I want you to just try and imagine the sheer visceral desperation of a parent in that exact situation. Knowing exactly what those bites meant, Joseph's mom just absolutely refused to accept defeat. She grabbed her severely injured boy and practically rushed him all the way to Paris. And remember, travel back then was no joke, but she was desperately hunting down a renowned scientist named Louis Pasteur. Pasteur had been working on something completely radical for the time, an experimental vaccine. But here's the huge catch. It had never actually been proven to save a human life after an exposure. Not once. It was a massive shot in the dark, driven purely by a mother's refusal to let her kid die. And all of this brilliantly illustrates just the sheer urgency and the almost miraculous nature of what went down next. Let's walk through this timeline together. Minute 1, that horrific 14-bite attack. Hours later, the frantic, desperate rush to Paris, literally racing against this unseen virus that's already starting to creep into the poor boy's peripheral nerves. Days later, they finally reach Louis Pasteur. He makes the agonizing, historically unprecedented decision to actually give this highly experimental vaccine. And then, weeks later, the incredible, completely world-changing result. Joseph Meister becomes the very first human being to ever survive a rabies infection. This intervention, which sounds so straightforward to us now, carries the full weight of medical history. Pasteur took a massively calculated risk. He administered a series of injections made from the spinal cords of infected rabbits. The goal? He was basically trying to train Joseph's immune system to fight off the pathogen before the actual rabies virus could complete its journey. You see, rabies doesn't just casually float around in your blood. It literally hijacks your peripheral nerves. It uses them like a physical superhighway to stealthily travel straight up to the central nervous system, and eventually, the brain. So this was a literal, high-stakes race up the nervous system between the vaccine-induced immunity and the virus itself. And guess what? The vaccine won. Meister didn't just survive. His survival proved that humanity actually had a fighting chance against our absolute most lethal microbial enemy. So, building on that, let's look at the truly shocking, really paradoxical part of this whole story. We have this incredible, monumental triumph in 1885 with little Joseph Meister. Yet, if we fast forward to today, with all of our amazing modern medical advancements, our biotechnology, our incredibly deep understanding of the human body, the reality is basically completely unchanged. If you do not get treatment in time, rabies remains deadly in almost all cases, period. The virus itself hasn't weakened at all. Its lethality and its devastatingly efficient method of attacking our nervous system honestly hasn't changed one single bit since the day it attacked that young boy. Which brings us directly to the ultimate differentiator between life and death: proper intervention. As researcher Charles Rupprecht highlights in his incredibly deep work on this subject, this single concept is literally the only thing standing between an exposure and a fatality today. Because the virus is so deeply lethal, there is absolutely no wait-and-see approach here. None. If you're bitten or scratched by an animal that you even suspect might have rabies, proper intervention is non-negotiable. And that means thoroughly washing the wound and immediately getting a very specific series of post-exposure vaccines. It is an absolute medical emergency. Basically, you're just repeating that exact same race Louis Pasteur started back in 1885, making absolutely sure the vaccine beats the virus to your brain.
So let's pause and summarize the core facts we've walked through in this explainer. And I'm going to purposely slow down here for a second because I really want the gravity of these points to fully stick with you. First, despite all of our modern progress, rabies remains the single most lethal infectious disease known to humankind. Second, without that proper immediate intervention we just talked about, it is deadly in almost all cases the moment symptoms actually appear. And third, because of that frankly terrifying fatality rate, any potential exposure requires immediate, decisive medical measures. The window for survival is open only briefly, and you have got to act while it is.
All of which brings us to a final, really provocative thought. Okay, so we know the history now, we know the terrifying statistics, but consider this question for a second. What actually makes it so dangerous to humans? Like, how does this invisible little pathogen manage to completely evade our body's natural defenses, totally hijack our nervous system, and achieve a near 100% kill rate? What is actually happening on a microscopic level? Well, that is the fascinating biological mystery right at the heart of Charles Rupprecht's work, and it is exactly what you should find yourself deeply, deeply curious to explore next. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep asking questions.